All right, I'm showing 10 a.m. So we're going to go ahead and get things started here. Just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. If you've got any questions, just due to the number of attendees, I would prefer if people would type those into the chat window. You should be able to access the chat window on your Zoom client there. If you've got any questions, just type those in there at any time throughout the webinar today, and we'll be happy to address those as they come in. If there's anything that comes up, during the discussion that we don't get to, obviously feel free to, reach out to us after the webinar, and we'll be happy to have any conversations with you, any questions that you have. So my name is Andrew Hoiberg. I'm in charge of the research and development and technical sales support here at Calcium Products. So we're gonna go ahead and get things started here, talking about our two main products today: SO4 Pelletized Gypsum and 98G Pelletized Limestone. For those of you who know some folks who aren't able to make it today, you can catch this same webinar here on September 16th. So you can tell some folks there that may have missed today's that there's another opportunity to do that. So talk a little bit about the company today, and then we'll dive into SO4, the pelletized gypsum, and discuss the kind of twofold nature of this product, primarily with the superior sulfur release, and then also some of the calcium benefits. And we'll also talk about 98G pelletized limestone, get into some discussions about correction, and especially the maintenance or maintaining your soil pH, and some of the benefits and that you can realize by using that type of a strategy. If we have time at the end, which generally speaking we don't with these webinars, we've got this scheduled for an hour today. But like I said, if anyone has any questions, please just type those in as we're getting going here. So talking a little bit here about the company, we were established in 1987 on our founder's vision that there had to be a better way to manage, the pH of soils by using some of the fine limestone powder that came off of some grinding operations for livestock, that he, just thought there's got to be a better way to take some of this fine material, turn it into pellets, and then utilize it in the agricultural arena. And so he was one of the first people to start pelletizing limestone back in the late 80s in the Midwest, and really was a pioneer in this field, and did a lot of great things to kind of further the industry of pelletizing limestone, and then ultimately gypsum as well, and being able to utilize that in agricultural settings, but also in the professional turf world. So we've a large majority of our business is agriculture, but we also do some work in the professional turf world as well. And then as a company, our three core beliefs are continuous improvement. We always want to be shipping out the best possible product, and finding the ways that we can improve that to help our dealers get the best, most consistent quality pelletized products that they can then utilize for their customers. And relationships really are core to our belief as a company as well. We're really steadfast in maintaining and developing these relationships with people, and really helping to provide solutions. And then of course, technology, the technology of spreading and the fertilizer world is continuing to evolve. And so it's one of our main goals to try and keep up with that, and have our products be integrated, and also our recommendations be up to speed as much as possible with the advancements in technology. And as you can see here, we've got a sales team that covers the Midwest pretty well, also up into Canada. This map is a little bit outdated right now, so we've got a couple changes that are in the process of being made. Some new reps coming on board, and some people taking new opportunities. So just keep in tune with us there, and we'll update that when it's time to. Talking about the geologic history of northwestern Iowa is important just to touch on briefly here, because it really helps explain why we have the type of products that we do. Looking back hundreds of millions of years ago, there was inland seas that ran, about the middle third or so of Iowa. And what that did is, as those seas evaporated and started to dissipate, it deposited a lot of minerals that were dissolved in that water, on top of a lot of marine life shells that are made out of calcium carbonate. That those deposits formed a lot of the rock, limestone, and gypsum rock beds that we have here in the state of Iowa. And then as the glaciers came they kind of covered up some of those, or covered up all those deposits. And then a meteorite about 80 million years ago hit that spot up in northwestern Iowa around the town of Manson, and created this kind of outcropping of rock that stuck up around the outside of where the meteorite hit. And then it brought some of those rocks to the surface. And that's how people started mining in that area of Iowa. Back in the 1800s, and created Gilmore City as the limestone capital of Iowa, and then Fort Dodge as the gypsum capital of Iowa. So, we've got some really good peer deposits in those areas that we're able to pull from as our raw material for our manufacturing process, and that really helps our products get started off on the right foot. And then, of course, it's the engineering on top of that that helps us realize those benefits into the soil and into the crops. So we'll start here with SO4 pelletized gypsum, talking about the superior sulfur release and also some of the calcium benefits. We just talked about the pure mine gypsum that this product is made from. It's got about a 94% purity when it comes out of the ground, and that's just something that you don't encounter very often with gypsum deposits. Once we get that raw material, we then take it and put it through a grinding process to where about 80% of it passes through a 100 mesh screen. And that's important because if you just throw a rock out there, and this is the same thing goes for limestone, but if you just throw a rock out there, it's not going to do much. You've got to expose the surface area inside that rock by grinding it, in order for it to actually solubilize and do what it's supposed to do in the soil. After we do that grinding process, we then put it into our pelletizing process. And what we're really trying to achieve here is a pellet that has ideal reactivity. So once it hits the soil and gets some moisture on it, that pellet starts to break down into those smaller particles that created the pellet and, do what it's supposed to do in the soil. The other side of this is we want a pellet that's strong enough to hold through the distribution channel. So it can go from our load out facility to the dealer's bin, and then out from their load out facility into the spreader. And so we want to make sure that we've got a pellet that's going to achieve both of those things. And if there's two things that we would like for you to remember here about SO4 today, is that it's a pH neutral sulfur source. So that means that there's no acidification that results from using this material. And it also has the ideal solubility that a plant needs in terms of the uptake pattern throughout the growing season, which we'll touch on more here in a minute. But when you think about other sulfur sources, ammonium sulfate is one that comes to mind. Elemental sulfur is another that comes to mind. Both of those products have to undergo a transformation in the soil, not necessarily on the sulfur side, but the ammonium sulfate is that ammonium is transformed into nitrate that leaves behind acidity in the soil. And then the same thing goes for elemental sulfur, as that sulfur gets oxidized into sulfate, which is the plant available form, that also leaves behind acidity in the soil. And so with SO4, you've already got calcium, which doesn't change forms in the soil. And you've got sulfate, calcium sulfate, so that doesn't have any transformation and therefore no acidifying process in the soil. This product is 21% calcium and 17% sulfur for your guaranteed analysis. And again, like I just alluded to, is this calcium sulfate. The dihydrate part of that is refers to the form of gypsum that we've got. And this technically is the formula for gypsum. There are other types of gypsum, like anhydrites, that don't have the two water molecules attached to it. And the reason that that's important is that water molecule helps to solubilize the material and helps to get it into the soil and do what it's supposed to do. You contrast that with anhydrite materials that aren't quite as soluble as the dihydrate version is. So we've already talked about its use as a sulfur fertilizer. Also, kind of the classical use for gypsum in agriculture is that as a soil amendment. And that, of course, is related to the calcium that's in there. Calcium is known as what's called a flocculating cation in the soil. That means that it brings particles together and helps to hold them together. And so it creates micro aggregates, and then therefore it creates aggregate stability in the soil, which is important for things like water infiltration, bulk density of the soil, air exchange, things of that nature. But of course, it is an excellent sulfur fertilizer, something that I think a lot more people are starting to get comfortable with and starting to realize is the sulfur benefits that you get from gypsum, especially when we talk about the release of the sulfur versus other types of sulfur fertilizers on the market. Sulfur fertility, I think finally feel like I'm getting to the point where I'm sort of preaching to the choir here a little bit about sulfur fertility. I think most people, realize that it's an important nutrient and really needs to be part of crop plans every season, not just every once in a while. And there's a ton of different things that are, you know, important about what sulfur does in the plants. You can see that list of stuff here. None of this stuff is, things that you really need to remember on a daily basis. But the one thing that I always kind of connect in my mind with how important sulfur is in the plant is the chlorophyll synthesis, and that's evident in the deficiency symptoms that we see with sulfur. If we have a sulfur deficient plant, it's going to be yellow. It's going to have some interveinal striping, some chlorosis, just like we do with nitrogen. But it's going to come out of the younger leaves versus the older leaves where you would see the nitrogen deficiency. And so sulfur is really closely tied with nitrogen in the plant. And so it's an important nutrient to have out there. And I think for the most part, folks are realizing that down to the grower level these days. So when we talk about that importance of solubility and the plant uptake, I always kind of lean on these two graphs that came out of some research at the University of Illinois in 2013. And this took a look at more modern hybrids and what their uptake patterns were like for a variety of different nutrients. But of course, for us, our main interest was in sulfur. And what we can see on these two graphs, corn on the left and soybean on the right, is that both of those crops are really need a season-long uptake of both of sulfur for both of those crops. And so it's important to have a sulfur source that's going to release sulfur all the way throughout the growing season and provide that sulfur fertility to the crop as it needs it throughout the growing season. So it's important that we have it early, middle, and then also in the late part of the season. If you see these gray bars here, on both of the crops, those are looking at roughly the 50% uptake. So after this point, roughly half of the total sulfur uptake still occurs. And if you go down to where these bars are represented on this bottom axis here, you can see that this is after the reproductive phase has already been initiated in both the crops. And so, we tend to think about deficiencies and fertility importance early on in the season because crops tend to show that deficiency early on in the season. But what we want to make sure we do is, account for the fact that 50% or greater of this uptake is going to happen after that reproductive phase has been initiated. So again, aligning ourselves with the sulfur source that's going to help accomplish this is very important to do. So this was a handful of years ago now, but we really wanted to take a closer look at, what kind of release patterns do we have with sulfur? Because, we really don't think a whole lot in fertilizer about the solubility of different sources of whether it's nitrogen or sulfur or whatever the case may be. For the most part, we tend to stick with the same kind of P and K products, and we're comfortable with the release of those and the build and the maintenance. But when we think about nutrients that aren't so persistent in the soil, like sulfur and nitrogen, it's important to think about the release. And on the nitrogen side of it, I guess we do think a lot about it because we've got all these, N stabilizers and different coatings and things like that will help us control the release of nitrogen. But on the sulfur side of things, we really don't think very much about that. We've got AMS, we've got elemental, which kind of represent two extremes of the spectrum. We've got one AMS that's extremely soluble. We've got elemental sulfur that's very slowly soluble. But when we think about gypsum and where it fits into that matrix, that's really what led to this research for us. So we built this apparatus in our lab here in Ames, and really wanted to highlight what those differences were in terms of how these different sulfur sources release fertilizer, and we release sulfur, and so we built this rainfall simulator in the lab to help us get a snapshot of throughout a growing season. How are we getting the sulfur and how is that being delivered to the plant? So you can see here, these are the results of this study, and not surprising to us, we saw a pretty big release from ammonium sulfate early on in the growing season. That's this darker blue line here, and what that represents is that pretty much all of the sulfate that was contained in that fertilizer application, this was a 25 pound of sulfur fertilizer application, was solubilized within that first month of rainfall. And that doesn't mean that it's all completely gone by May or June, but what it does mean is that all that sulfur, that sulfate, has been solubilized into the soil solution, putting it at a much greater risk for leaching throughout the rest of the growing season. And then this lighter blue line that's right below that is a co-granulated product that has, MAP as the base, and then AMS and elemental sulfur. The marketing claim generally is that you'll get the ammonium sulfate early on in the season, and then you'll get the elemental oxidized towards the end of the season. You can clearly see that the ammonium sulfate part of that behaves basically like a normal AMS application, but we don't get any additional benefit from that elemental later in the season. Elementals, there's been a lot of research that shows that you're really only going to get about 30% of an application solubilized in any given year. And so if you haven't been using it for 3 or 4 years consistently at the same time, then you're probably not getting all the sulfur that you think you are out of those applications, especially if you put it out in the spring. It's definitely got to go out in the fall. So this green line here represents SO4 pelletized gypsum, which shows a nice early season release and then a nice steady supply throughout the rest of the growing season. And again, this doesn't mean in September that it's all gone. It just means that this has continued to put sulfur into that soil solution all the way up, basically until harvest. So thinking back to those graphs where the crop really needs that uptake to occur all the way throughout the growing season and have a sulfur source that's going to maintain that soil solution with sulfate, SO4 really is the best choice here. And we talked about the acidification. This soil pH was 5.9 when we started the study. You could see with the AMS application, it dropped down to 5.7 by the end of the study. And then with the MAP and AMS and elemental, it dropped down to 5.4 because you're getting some additional acidification with the MAP component of that fertilizer. It's pretty interesting stuff, obviously from our seat in the ballpark. So looking at some of the different comparisons here in a table format, obviously you get calcium with the SO4 that you don't get with the other kind of typical sulfur fertilizers. Sulfate, sulfur 24 versus 17, so just a little bit lower in SO4, but that also allows for better application uniformity with a slightly higher application rate of the SO4. And then with the acidification, we talked about that just on the previous slide, but we did some calculations that if we're looking at a 25 unit of sulfur application, how many pounds of our 98G would we need to neutralize that type of an application? And we would need 120 pounds of 98G pelletized limestone to offset a 25 unit sulfur application from AMS, and we would need 80 pounds of it to do the same thing with elemental sulfur. And then again, you don't get any acidification from SO4 because there's no nutrient transformation. And then looking on the kind of the continuum of solubility, rapid with AMS, slow with elemental, and ideal with SO4. This is something that we kind of put together based on a dealer of ours in Canada. They had some pictures of plant roots that had kind of connected right up to some of the SO4 pellets. And so one of the things we thought would be kind of interesting to do is to plant some seeds with some sulfur fertilizer pellets, down into the soil and see if the corn roots tended to grow towards one or the other. And, this was pretty cool. We thought were the majority of the corn roots in this particular plant that we planted in these jars headed right over to the SO4. And then you can see in this next picture here that you literally have the root connected right up to some of those pellets, which helps highlight the fact that these, not only is it a great sulfur source, but it's also a very safe sulfur source. It doesn't have a high salt index like some of the other fertilizers do. And so therefore it doesn't have crop burn potential. It's safe for the roots, it's safe in furrow, all that kind of stuff. So an interesting picture nonetheless. So getting to some of our trial results here, this is research data that goes back to 1998. A large majority of it comes from Iowa State University. They've been using SO4 as their choice of sulfur fertility for their trials that started in 2006. The reason being is they don't have the confounding effect of nitrogen. They can put out SO4 and they can really see the benefits from the sulfur without having to parse out, different effects from other fertilizers, nutrients that are in there. And it also it's an easy product to work with for them, and they've had a lot of good success with it in those trials. And so a lot of that is represented in this. We also do a lot of our own research with third parties and with dealers. So that's all kind of compiled into this overall SO4 trial result. We comparing it to no sulfur, we see a 14.5 bushel increase. And of course, this just helps highlight the importance of sulfur fertility, but it also helps show you how good of a sulfur fertilizer SO4 is and the type of success we've seen with it. over the last 23 years or so. Looking at Iowa specifically, we see about a 14 bushel increase, and this shows you all the different counties that we've had these trials in. Again, a lot of them are through Iowa State, which obviously helps give it some solid validity. But we've got various different soil types that have been tested. We've got different types of application regimens, pre-plant, post-emergent, 2-year residual effect type applications. So we've tested it out in a lot of different scenarios, and are confidently able to communicate through to our dealers and growers that SO4 does have a lot of application flexibility, can be put on at a lot of different times and still show really good benefits. This is one trial that I like to point out here. This is 150 pound per acre put on at V5 at the Iowa State Northern Research Farm in Kanawha. It's up in north central Iowa. And the one thing that's kind of interesting about this is that this is a silt loam soil, 3.5% organic matter, where we traditionally wouldn't have expected a huge sulfur response out of this. But there was a grower that lived just south of here, and he had tried SO4 after not having good success with AMS or elemental. And so he put out SO4, and he had a couple of areas in his fields that had some clay hills and things of that nature, and immediately saw a 30 bushel increase the first season that he used SO4. And so he told these guys up at the Iowa State Northern Research Farm that they should give it a shot, since they had some similar types of soils up there, and they saw the same type of response. You can see this picture shows a clear response with the SO4 application to the left, and then right in front of here, the sulfur deficient crop that didn't receive any SO4. So obviously highlighting the importance. There's a better picture of the application line there where the SO4 was applied versus where it wasn't. And a lot of times when you do a rescue type application, you don't see the sulfur deficiency or the difference in the application go all the way through to harvest, but you can clearly see that that line of delineation between where it was applied and where it wasn't there on the right. So this was one of those trials that just kind of highlights the performance of SO4 and the type of results you can see in the right scenarios. Soybeans are another crop that we've expanded out our research program in here for the last handful of years. If you'd have asked me 7-8 years ago if soybeans needed to have sulfur fertility, I would have said no. It's a waste of money, don't bother. But as we've continued to mine more and more sulfur with our corn crops out of fields that we're rotating beans into, I think that there has been an opportunity, certainly in the last several years, that we've seen good benefit from putting sulfur out onto soybeans. And we had some dealers approach us about this and say, hey, this is something we've been thinking about, and something we've been doing some kind of testing of our own internally, and we think it's showing some good promise. And so we've expanded out our own research program with this, and I've been seeing a lot of success with putting SO4 out on soybeans as well. On average, about a 3.3 bushel increase versus no sulfur. So some nice results, and spread out throughout the Midwest as well. So these are just some other state trial summaries that we've got. This stuff's all available on our website. If this is anything you want to go take a look at, we've got all these this is just a snapshot of the research brief, but you can go get the full one of any of these on our website. These are all available under the dealer support section of our website. And if you have any trouble finding that, just let us know. We'll help you navigate there. But 10.6 bushel increase in Minnesota, 10.9 in Nebraska, 20 bushel increase in Illinois. I've had some really good success over there, and that's a state, where we it lagged a little bit behind on the sulfur response compared to other states because they're a little bit further east, and we're still getting a little bit more of that sulfate deposition from the atmosphere, when other states further west like Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, and the Dakotas weren't getting as much of that anymore. But Illinois is starting to get to the point where we're seeing a lot better sulfur response as well. South Dakota, 8 bushel on average increase there as well. So we do have a good compendium of research, and something we're very proud of is our database of research that we've got, and the benefits that we can show with SO4. this was a trial up in Wisconsin from 2015, where we had a very sandy soil, which tends to be an area where AMS doesn't shine real well, but SO4 does because of that release that we talked about. But as you can see with the pictures of the plants below here, we saw a really nice increase in the color and the pod count. And also, we didn't see the reduction in pH like we did with that AMS application. So looking at another trial that we did in Wisconsin, where we saw an average. This was one that we did side by side with AMS. This was a corn trial, different from the one that we showed in the previous picture there. But a lot of times people will say sulfate is sulfate. It doesn't really matter as long as you get some sulfate out there for the crop. That might be the case in certain soil types, but once you start leaning into the more coarse textured soils, getting into your sandy loams and your silty loams and into your extremely sandy soils, for sure, you can definitely start to see some differences in AMS and SO4 application. So with this particular trial, we were able to show an 8 bushel advantage over AMS, and then obviously where the control was, where no sulfur was applied, there was a 26 bushel increase. So this was a pre-plant application that was put down in early June before that corn crop went down, and we saw some pretty clear differences between AMS and SO4 there. And you can see here in the pictures as well that you've got the AMS application in the middle and then the SO4 on the right. You can see how much healthier that crop looks compared to the other two there. So shifting gears here a little bit, we've talked a lot about the sulfur benefits that we get from SO4, but there's also something to be said for the calcium part of it. And this really, again, gets into the soil amending side of things. Certainly calcium nutrition in the plants is important. It's that nutrient is taken up in large volumes by the plants. However, it's a little bit more difficult to place a tangible value on calcium nutrition. It's harder to see true deficiencies of calcium and true responses from calcium as a nutrient. But so really the benefit comes more on the soil side of things. It's a little bit less tangible. It's a little bit harder to see, but every year we have dealers and growers that tell us how much better their soils performed, particularly in wet years, which of course this hasn't been much of a wet year for some of us in the Midwest anyway. But particularly in some of those situations where you have drainage issues and things like that, SO4 has shown a lot of benefit over time for a lot of different folks for us. And so some of these areas listed in the bullets here are places where we've seen responses to SO4 in the soil amending application. So high pH spots, new tile installations, quote unquote tight soils, which of course would be clay soils, heavy clay soils, calcium to magnesium ratios. It's something that we don't put a whole lot of credence into. It's really hard to change your cal-mag ratio. That's something that tends to be more of an inherent property in the soil. If you've got a lot of magnesium in your soil, it's probably because you're in a area that has a lot of dolomitic limestone as the parent material, and it's hard to use something like gypsum, even if you're using it at tons per acre. It's hard to make a dent in that cal-mag ratio, and there's been tons of research that's been done on the cal-mag ratios and has never really shown that it's something that we need to be too concerned about. Now, that's not to say that using gypsum applications can't help overcome some of the things that magnesium can do in the soil. So typically, if you've got high mag and you've got high clay, you're in that category that's right above there of the tight soils, and you can see some benefits from putting gypsum applications out to help increase the hydraulic conductivity of the soil, which is a fancy way of saying water infiltration. But gypsum can help do that in some of those scenarios. If you are looking for more of a corrective type application in those scenarios, you probably want to look at a higher rate than you would for sulfur. So the sulfur application, general application range is 75 to 150 pounds, depending on crop and soil type. But we tend to recommend, 200, 300, 400 pounds of SO4 be used in some of these areas. And it's always something you should try before you, go all in on it. It's, we can't always predict exactly where it's going to help in these soil amending type applications. So certainly something to try out before you go all in on it. So we've talked about the application flexibility, but it can be a spring or a fall application. And I know that sounds a little too good to be true, but we've got the research to help support that. And we've also got dealers that have been using it in these various application regimens for a long time that help support it as well. And the nice thing about putting it out in the fall is you don't have to worry about it in the spring. You don't have to worry about what that weather window is going to look like to get your sulfur application out. And as that temperature goes down, as the soils start to freeze, the solubility of gypsum is going to go down as well. And so it's going to help maintain that sulfur in the pellet, in the soil, so it can release out in the spring when the crop starts to grow. Also, certainly blendable with P and K for the fall applications, or top dress nitrogen applications, after emergence in the spring. So certainly okay to use it with stabilizers as long as you're sticking to the rates and the timings and all that kind of good stuff. So this is kind of a snapshot of some updated economics that we look at comparing SO4 with AMS in a fall applied scenario. This is a 24 unit sulfur application. And we give, we try and look at this as sort of a holistic type of a model where we give some benefit to the calcium, we give some credit to the nitrogen part of AMS. We also, looking at it as a fall application, kind of take away some of the cost of the potential for leaching nitrogen and leaching sulfur out of the soil over the fall and the winter before the crop needs it in the spring. And there is plenty of research to help support that as well. The acidification cost as well, we've talked about how ammonium sulfate acidifies the soil. And so when we look at this, if we are looking, let's say at this kind of middle table on the right here, if we're looking at this on just a sulfur only type of a application, you can see that SO4 sits at about 16 and change, and AMS application, because of the pricing volatility right now, sits at about a $22 per acre application. So that would be looking at it just as a sulfur cost. But if we go and we give credit to the nitrogen, give credit to the calcium, and then also kind of add back cost to it because of the leach nitrogen and the leach sulfur, and then add back cost for the acidification as well, you can see that price difference, which was already about $6 to begin with, starts to look more like $12 when you do it as a kind of a holistic adjusted cost model. So this is the way that we look at kind of competing our product against ammonium sulfate in the fall application scenario. This is something that we can do for dealers on a one-on-one basis. So if you want to work with your territory sales manager, we can put in your exact costs and put in your, put in your pricing and all that kind of good stuff, and can really dial this down to a specific application in your own backyard. So, but this, with the commodity prices where they are right now, and then the increase in the cost of fertilizers, this helps to support how SO4 really has a more of a maintained steady cost structure along with it compared to the commoditized fertilizers. This is a video here. Whoops. Don't know if it's going to work, if the sound's going to work, but we'll give it a shot here. Actually, I don't even know if the video itself is going to work. Well, oh, there it goes. Don't need to watch it twice there. So get this back. So kind of boiling down the SO4 main selling points for the agronomist at the farm gate. This is something we get asked a lot about, okay, you've given me all this information. How can we synthesize all this down into some main selling points here? So when it comes down to the main points for us, it really is first and foremost about that ideal solubility. That's something that we want people to think more about in the sulfur arena. Let's choose a sulfur source that meets the plant uptake and helps the crop have the best chance of getting its maximum yield, and don't let sulfur hold it back. Doesn't degrade the pH, and the calcium can help the soil. So we know there's some benefits from the calcium as well, and then we hear that a lot from folks that use SO4, and so we know that there's some value to that calcium there, even though it's kind of hard to put a monetary value on it. But the fact that it's not degrading the pH and giving some benefit to the calcium is helping to not degrade the soil quality, but helping to improve that. And then lower adjusted costs in AMS, like we just talked about through those economics there. You can get a lot of leaching of the nitrogen and the sulfur with the AMS fall application, which we still see a lot of in the Midwest. And then looking at the overall ROI right now with SO4 on both corn and soybeans. I've only got the corn represented here, but it's pretty much a slam dunk in terms of getting your investment back and then some. So these are kind of what we boil it down to. And then of course the last thing is the application flexibility that we talked about as well. Fall and spring, a lot of different ways that you can handle that, and that really helps benefit the both the grower and the dealer in that scenario. So that's what we've got for SO4. So we'll go ahead and shift gears here over to 98G, so we can keep on time here. I'm a little bit behind as I usually am after talking about SO4, but getting into 98G pelletized limestone, we talked about our manufacturing process in the SO4 part of the discussion here today. It's a very similar type of thing for 98G. We do grind it a little bit finer because limestone is a less soluble mineral than gypsum is, and so it's more important to get more of that surface area exposed so that once it does hit the soil, we really do get that reactivity and that action that we want from it. So with this, taking advantage of all those fine particles and putting them into a pellet, and allowing for precise application, we're really left with efficient both correction and maintenance of soil pH. But maintenance is really the thing that we're focusing a lot on, and we have been now for the last couple of years. We think that maintenance is the way to strategically manage your pH, and is really the way that we should be thinking about it moving forward. Soil pH, again, I think we're to the point now where people are starting to understand its importance, but there's always some room for education as well. But the biggest thing with soil pH is that it governs the availability of pretty much every nutrient in the soil, and there are certain ones that are more highlighted than others, phosphorus being one of those. But you just can't stress the importance of soil pH enough. It allows everything from the biology of the soil to the chemistry of the soil, and even some of the physical properties of the soil to behave how they should. And so keeping an eye on the pH and really thinking about it more proactively is just going to help to maximize that yield environment year after year. We already alluded to this idea of nitrogen fertility resulting in net acidification for the soil. And, there's lots of different ways soils can become acidified over time, but by and large, the majority of the acidification that comes from soils, and the reason that we have to think about pH in the first place, is because we acidify the soil with our nitrogen fertilizers. Each one of these different nitrogen fertilizers acidifies the soil to a different degree because of the way that they're composed chemically. But anhydrous ammonia, because of the volume that we use it, contributes the most acidification to the soil. It's not the most acidifying nitrogen fertilizer, but just because of the volume that we use it at, does contribute the most acidification overall. But everything we use, urea, ammonium nitrate, ammonium sulfate, MAP, and DAP, all of those contribute some acidification of the soil. So it's not just a problem of anhydrous or just a problem of MAP or DAP. It's a whole systems approach to why we're acidifying the soils and why we should think about it more proactively. This is some research that was done with the USDA up in the northern plains. I believe it was South and North Dakota where this trials took place. But the interesting thing to me is that they really took a deeper look at where is the acidification happening, how does soil tests influence our interpretation of pH results on the depth at which we sample. And really what they were able to identify, which shouldn't be terribly surprising to anyone, is that the top 3 inches of the soil were the most acidified. And so when you take a soil core that's 6 inches deep and you look at the top 3 inches versus the bottom 3 inches, there was a significant difference in how the pH value of those. The top was a lot more acidified than the bottom was. But then once you mix those two together and had the resulting soil test pH reading, it was diluted because of those bottom 3 inches of that soil core. And so they were basically making a case that, if you really want to know how acidified your soil is, you should only test the top 3 inches of it and should base your application of liming materials on that pH number. Now I know that people aren't going to go run out and just test the top 3 inches of their soil, but it just helps us to know that this is where that active acidification is taking place. It helps us to be more proactive about the maintenance of the soil pH, better usage of our liming materials, and really being proactive about this whole approach. And that's the main point for all what we're talking about here with maintenance today. So giving just kind of an overview of the maintenance program that we've come up with here at Calcium Products. Again, we want to neutralize that active acidification. So as that acidification takes place in the course of a growing season, we want to be able to offset that as quickly as possible so that it doesn't build into a problem over the course of time. If we think traditionally about how we manage soil pH, it's based on the soil tests that we're taking every 4 or 5 years. Now, I know things are getting a little bit more frequent with certain growers and retailers, but I think still there's even some folks that aren't even testing for pH. It's something they don't think about. So if we can think about this irrespective of our. Okay, everybody with me there? I think I'm back now. Okay, Glenn says I'm back. Sorry about that. My internet connection decided to take a pause there. So anyway, getting back to the proactive maintenance approach, really this allows us to neutralize that active acidification, and the rates that we've come up with are about 1 pound of 98 G to 1 unit of nitrogen. So if you're putting out 200 units of nitrogen, you're going to go put out about 200 pounds of 98 G to offset that acidification. This is based on a lot of models that we've run, a lot of different dealers that we've worked with on looking at different nitrogen rate scenarios, different types of nitrogen, things of that nature. And getting back to this idea of proactive pH management, more frequent, lower rate applications. We're really encouraging folks to, after every corn crop or right before your bean crop or before your corn crop, wherever you have the ability to put it out, we're recommending that these applications go out at least every other year, if not every year, to help tackle this. So we're really starting to look at it more as like a traditional fertilizer application. To where we're putting this out more frequently, we've got lower rates, all that kind of stuff. So this also allows for greater application flexibility and blending. We do have variable rate equations, but if it's going to be a blended application, probably it's going to go out as a flat rate. But we are seeing good research results from these type of application rates that we'll talk about here in a minute, and really looking at the long-term benefit of helping to maintain that soil quality and that pH value over the course of time. Speaking of the yield results, so these results are from an expanded network of trials. This only started in about 2017 when we started thinking about this idea of pH maintenance, and what it all became apparent to us is when we were doing some different rate trials, we saw that even though the pH continued to go up as the rate went up, we didn't see continued yield benefits as we went from 500 to 1,000 to 2,000 pounds of material that went out. So this gave me an idea of, well, maybe we need to start looking at these lower application rates and really dialing in on where we should be using them, how often we should be using them, and what kind of yield benefits can we see from that. And these yield results have even been a little bit surprising to me. I was expecting to see some benefit from them, but not quite to the degree that we've seen them. So this is we've seen on average an 11.8 bushel increase versus areas where we did not put out the 98G, and that has been pretty consistent now, and it's actually gone up just in the last couple of years. We're continuing to see better and greater benefits from this. Average application rates are from 200 to 300 pounds. Again, that's more or less based on the type of nitrogen application regimen that we're putting out there. And these were actually all spring broadcast applications because that's the options that we had with some of the research partners that we've been putting out. So again, to help highlight the application flexibility, if you can get this done in the fall, great. But if you need to do it in the spring, certainly nothing wrong with doing that. Traditionally we don't think of liming applications going out in the spring. But with the ability to do that with 98G, that just adds another tool to your toolbox from the standpoint of pH management. Now, when we think about why 98G works a lot better than Aglime does, of course you can't put Aglime out at 200 pounds per acre. It's just not possible with that type of material. But we kind of boil it down to a typical Aglime analysis. This is something that we call an Aglime stack, where we take a given Aglime, a dealer's Aglime, and kind of separate it out based on the particle size. And then we kind of show them, this is why you might not have such great reactivity with your Aglime, or why you have to put it out at such a higher rate compared to 98G. A lot of that is built into this red area. It's a stoplight analogy of the red stuff you're not going to get benefit from because it's too coarse. The yellow stuff you get benefit from, but it's also susceptible to drift loss. And then the stuff that's right in the middle, the green, is very reactive, but you don't get any drift from it. So this is kind of the stuff in the middle that you're going to get the benefit from. The coarse stuff, which represents 70% of this particular Aglime sample, it's not going to be, it's too coarse to break down and effectively change the pH of the soil. Then this 18% down here is really good at changing the pH of the soil. This is the most reactive stuff in this particular sample because of the particle size. And again, this is the type of material we would use to make 98G with, is a super fine material. That's why it's so effective as a pH source, because we're able to take advantage of that super fine material, pelletize it, and use 100% of that to help us, maintain or correct the pH of the soil. Another thing to point out here is most state liming analysis only use up to 60 mesh. They don't give any additional benefit, even though there's been research that's shown that you get additional benefit from a finer grind of limestone than you do compared to the coarse material. So these are just kind of in a nutshell some of the reasons that we see much better reactivity and much better results with 98G comparing it to Aglime. We do have quite a comprehensive database of different Aglimes in the Midwest, and kind of how they compare to 98G. This map is available on our website under the 98G challenge area. And, we do have all the pertinent chemical information. And then in most cases, we've got a picture that will show you a stack like we saw in the previous, the previous slide. And there's also a link down here for a lab analysis that will show you all this chemical data from the Midwest Labs test that we did with it. So this is a good resource if you're, trying to convince people that there is a difference between 98G and Aglime, and you can go just click on any one of these dots that's close by to you, and it'll help give you some good fodder for those discussions. We talked about the drift loss piece of this already, and everyone's seen this cloud of dust trailing behind an Aglime spreader. You can see that on the top is an Aglime application. Down here is a 98G application. And I live out amongst a lot of cornfields and bean fields, and I don't think there's been a day this summer where it hasn't been below a 10 or 12 mile an hour wind. A lot of days it's even more than that as well. But you can see this is something that we worked with the USDA on to do some modeling of drift loss and how much of that finest, most reactive material is drifting off target during those applications. And even on a moderately windy day, you're still losing 20-25% of that finest, most reactive material. And so again, that just helps support the message that what you think you're getting with Aglime is not what you're really getting. It looks like a nice big pile of liming material when you see it stacked on the side of the field, but once you dig into it a little bit, break down those particles and look at the drift loss and consider what the state analysis looks at versus where the actual reactivity takes place, you can quickly see that there's a pretty significant difference there. And then when we talk about the precision application aspect of this, all that fine material drifting off target is not going to help you manage these, smaller spots on the grids on this field. And so 98G is a much better selection in terms of precision application. And we've got correction equations that we've got integrated into most of the big software systems that are out there now. If you don't have access to those equations and would like access to those, please let us know, and we'll get you suited with those. And when we look at, over the course of a correction, this would be more of a pH correction and maintenance type of a scenario. If we're starting at a suboptimal pH and are able to achieve the target pH value a lot quicker with 98G than we would be with Aglime. And not to mention the fact that you really have to over apply. If we were just shooting for a target pH of 6.0 with this Aglime, we would never probably reach it throughout the course of this 4-year snapshot that we're looking at here. So you really have to even overshoot the application rate, a target of 6.5 to ever be above that threshold value of 6.0 with Aglime during this time period. So what that results in is kind of a, it's like the classic roller coaster buildup. You've got suboptimal pH for most of the first year because of the slow reactivity. And you've got 2 years of, relative pH success. And then again, you're declining during this last year where you've also got suboptimal pH. And that's where the yield differences kind of kick in when you're looking at a 98G versus an Aglime type scenario. And then right here in the middle is where we would put out one of those maintenance rates and then just maintain that pH where it is. So we don't have to worry about this roller coaster going back down. And that's once you get into that cycle of getting the pH where we want it and then putting those maintenance application rates out, every other year or so, you're able to maintain that pH where you want it and maximize that yield environment every year. So Iowa State did some research on this very topic a couple of years ago. This was published in the Soil Science Society's journal, peer reviewed. It's as rigorous can get for scientific publication and research. What they did was they took the state liming system for Iowa and equalized what these application rates should be. And the benchmark for all these scoring systems is always going to be pure calcium carbonate, 100% calcium carbonate. That's why we see terms like the calcium carbonate equivalents or the effective calcium carbonate equivalents. All these state scoring systems are based on the activity of 100% pure calcium carbonate. So we should be able to take that scoring system, take any liming material. We know the particle size distribution of it. We know the chemical purity of it. We know the moisture content of it, and being able to take those 3 things, we should be able to plug that into an equation and say, okay, here's how much material you need to apply to have it behave exactly like this pure calcium carbonate does. As you can see here, neither the dolomitic or the calcitic limestone came even remotely close to behaving like that pure calcium carbonate did, but 98G came a heck of a lot closer. And so when you look at the overall activity and the pH change of the respective liming materials, there was a 43% improvement in the efficiency, the effectiveness, of 98G over dolomitic and 25% over the calcitic limestone. And the thing that's also interesting to note here is that there was a 0.7 pH unit difference between the calcitic and the 98G, and an entire unit of pH difference. And while saying 1 or 0.7 might not sound all that impressive, you have to remember that the pH scale is logarithmic. And so that means that it's, a step from one to another is an order of magnitude difference. And so 0.7 on the pH scale and 1.0 on the pH scale is a huge difference. So this just really helps solidify everything that we've talked about in terms of how 98G performs better because of the fact that we take that good, pure, chemically composed limestone, we put it through our process of grinding and pelletizing, and we're able to, have it perform pretty similarly to 100% calcium carbonate. That research, full research brief, is also available on our website in case anyone wants it. So taking a little bit of a look here at a pH maintenance type of scenario and, what kind of return on investment we would see on that based on the research results. And so most of the time, if you're in a situation where you're suboptimal in your pH, and you don't have the time or the money to go through a corrective application, you can still use these maintenance applications. This maintenance application doesn't just fit in the middle of a correction type scenario. And again, we're really trying to get people to think and look at 98G as more of a maintenance, more frequent, lower rate type application product versus a big corrective product. While it certainly can and does perform well in those corrective situations, we're seeing a lot of good financial benefit from these types of lower rate, more frequent applications as well. So this just gives you a snapshot of the spread rate, target pH we're going for, corn price, grower price, etc. Of course, this is going to vary depending on your specifics. And again, it's something that we can work with you one-on-one to get something dialed in for your specific location. So when we look at this 200-pound 98G rate in the first year of this rotation, looking at about an 11 bushel increase on average, taking out the cost of the application, that's almost $39 of profit increase using the 98G. And then again, doing that same thing every other year, you'd see an additional 38.80 of increase, and then the overall profit in that 4 years of doing the maintenance program is very attractive, and I think something that we're trying to get a lot more people thinking about. And again, really treating this more like a fertilizer application than a liming application, even though we are obviously getting a liming benefit, helping to increase that nutrient availability and helping to maximize the yield environment. And as you can see, getting some nice results out of that. So there are some other pelletized limestones out there. We take a lot of pride in our manufacturing process and the differentiation that we've got versus the other pelletized limestones on the market. Nobody grinds their material as fine as we do. Nobody has the purity of the raw material like we do, and nobody has the know-how and the pelletizing knowledge that we do. And so, there's other ones out there that may have a cheaper price tag on the per tonnage basis, but when you factor in the chemical purity and come in, calculate a pounds equivalence that you'll see down here on the second to bottom row, you can see that if we use 98G as the 100-pound equivalent, because of the magnesium content and the chemical impurity that you see in that, you would need almost a 2-to-1 ratio to have the same type of activity. A 1.2 to 1 ratio with another product out of Western Iowa, and then a 1.1 ratio. So once you factor in the additional product that you need to have the same kind of activity, oftentimes 98G comes in at the same cost or sometimes even a little bit lower. And we've got more information on this that we can discuss with you based on your geographic location. So here's a quick video to show you some of the things that we've talked about kind of in action. So we've got a Aglime here on the left, 98G in the middle, and then another pelletized limestone on the right. And this is vinegar that's in these cups to help kind of represent mild soil acidity that we would see. And what you'll see here, as we start to play this, we'll put the Aglime in first, give it a quick stir. You'll see some initial reactivity from the fine particles that are in there, but then it dies off very quick as those coarse particles start to try and dissolve, and they're just not providing much more of that CO2 evolution is what you're seeing there as it neutralizes the acidity in the vinegar. That's carbon dioxide that's created there. So you can see the Western Iowa pelletized lime. Again, you're getting some reactivity from some of those fine particles, but as you can see here with 98G, there's just a huge clear difference in terms of how it reacts, not only in the initial phase, but also the sustained reactivity over time. And so, this people tend to think, well, we put out Aglime, we get the coarse particles out there, we get some continued benefit from it, and that really isn't true. It's not a slow release that you get from coarse particles, it's a no release that you get out of those. And so you can see clearly here that 98G is a much more reactive and a much more sustained type of product. So looking at operational efficiencies, obviously you're going to gain some of that with 98G. If we're looking at lower rates, more frequently, you're treating it more like a normal fertilizer. You don't have to worry about field piling. You don't have to worry about, the additional labor that's going to be incurred with dealing with Aglime. There's a lot of inconsistency with Aglime. There's a lot of availability issues with Aglime. I think we've hit all these points pretty good already. Again, like I've already mentioned, there's a lot of good application flexibility with 98G. You can do a blended maintenance rate with other products if needed. You can do VR or flat rate. We do, again, have equations that are available and should be with most of the large software providers, but if not, please reach out to us and we'll get you all set up with that. So again, boiling this down to the main selling points for agronomists at the farm gate. More rapid and complete pH change versus Aglime, which is backed up by that Iowa State research study that we just talked about, correcting and then again, especially maintaining that pH precisely. The maintenance program showing a really good return as well. So we just went through the economics on that, but we can certainly talk through that more with you if you want to. And then looking at a kind of an economic comparison or value proposition and that 4-year profitability for the grower, 98G, if we look at it with Aglime and do one of these economic comparisons for you specifically, we can almost always show that 98G is competitive on a cost basis with Aglime, even though the cost per ton doesn't make it look that way. But once we boil it down to the application rate, the yield benefit increases, and look at the holistic picture of it, a lot of times it's a pretty clear decision for which product should be used. So, well, here we are, 11:01. We got through it without running over too bad here. So I would say if you've got questions or comments at this point, if you want to reach out to your territory sales rep, or if you want to reach out to Glenn Howell or myself, you can get all of our contact information on the website.